I am delighted to welcome resident Swami and head of the Vedanta Society of New York, Swami Sarvapriyananda. Alongside him, we have the highly accomplished philosopher, author, and scientist Dr. Bernardo Kastrup. Welcome and namaste, Swami.
Thank you very much for having me in this event. And it's an honor to be with Bernardo and Ivy and Sam, and with the rest of you who are in our live audience. So I'll just start with what I'm comfortable with, which is the Advaita Vedanta perspective and a little broader picture of some of the other allied schools of Indian philosophy. The subject today is, the Ivy just told us if you look into that, it's self, consciousness, what is the world, and life itself, basically. So all the really, really big subjects, really big questions. All right. So first, I think it will be helpful to get a view of classical Advaita Vedanta in brief, and then maybe open it up. Then maybe Bernardo can come in. So Advaita Vedanta is one of the many schools of ancient Indian philosophy. It's based on the Vedas, which are the foundational texts of Hinduism. In the Vedas, there are these texts called the Upanishads, which give us sort of the final or the highest conclusions of Vedic Hinduism. And based on the Upanishads, the orthodox schools of Hindu philosophy have developed over millennia. So the term Vedanta itself refers to the Upanishads, the source of spiritual knowledge called the Upanishads. Advaita Vedanta is one of the schools of Vedanta, but I would dare say it's sort of preeminent because of certain reasons which make it peculiarly sort of acceptable to the modern mind. There is little to no theology there, and the emphasis is on experience and reason. So Advaita Vedanta gives tremendous emphasis, importance to life as we experience it, and then uses reason to come to its conclusions. Just like all the other schools of Indian philosophy, whether Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, all of these ancient schools, the purpose was more or less the same. How do we overcome suffering? How do we attain fulfillment in life? So very practical purpose. But they very soon realized that they must have a current view of reality in order to achieve their aims, and especially a view of who or what is it that is seeking to overcome suffering and attain fulfillment. And the moment they focused on the self, the one which is trying to attain fulfillment and go beyond suffering, immediately they came upon the question of mind and consciousness. So mind and consciousness became a central question of Indian philosophy from the very beginning. From the Upanishads itself, these questions have come up. For example, one of the Upanishads goes right to what we might today call the hard problem of consciousness. It's called the Kena Upanishad, and it starts with a question. Most of these Upanishads are in the form of dialogues. So it starts with a question: what is it that gives us this experience of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting? What is it that enables us to speak? What enables the mind to think thoughts, and so on? So basically, what is it that's powering our first-person experience of life? Just imagine, thousands of years ago, it starts with this question, and it straight away answers that it is consciousness. And then it talks about the nature of consciousness and how we know this nature of consciousness, and that's what sets us free from unhappiness or sorrow. The conclusion of Advaita Vedanta was that we are, in a sense, profoundly mistaken about our own nature. So when we try to find out who or what we are, we find that what we thought we were, without thinking too much, what we intuitively take ourselves to be, this little body, and it seems to be a tiny part of a vast material universe. And taking ourselves to be this, and with some kind of thinking going on inside, a kind of a bundle of thoughts and living matter, which is very small, very weak, subject to all sorts of illnesses and accidents and disappointments in life, and doomed to certain death in a very short time. And we seem to inhabit this vast, uncaring physical universe, which is going to go on. And we are not going to go on. We're going to die very soon. So this idea, this unquestioned idea about our reality, this, according to Advaita Vedanta, is at the source of our unhappiness. As long as we think we are that and we don't question it, there is really no way of breaking out of this deep existential trap we find ourselves in. And Advaita says the truth couldn't be farther from this. It's almost the other end of the spectrum. It says that we are actually not bits of matter. We are unlimited consciousness, being, consciousness, bliss, existence, consciousness, bliss, Sat, Chit, Ananda. These are the terms used in Advaita Vedanta. In fact, one interesting thing is that it just occurred to me very late, just maybe in the recent times, that the three biggest questions of philosophy, basically all of philosophy: what is real? So metaphysics tries to answer that. And how do we know anything or experience or know anything at all? Epistemology tries to answer that. And what's the point of it all? Is there, like beauty, goodness, morality, all of these questions? So the term used in modern philosophy is axiology, I think. There used to be different branches like ethics and aesthetics. They've all been grouped together under sort of what is good and beautiful. Now, what struck me was the Advaita Vedanta view of the ultimate nature of things, which is Sat, Chit, Ananda. It seems to be a direct answer to these three questions of philosophy. What is real? Pure being, isness, existence itself is real. And how do we know anything? How do we experience anything? Well, this existence is not a dull, dead object, material object. It's conscious, or it is consciousness itself. It is existence and consciousness. There's a new term used nowadays: presence. I like that thing. Presence means something that is, but is also aware. So it is Sat, pure being, limitless being, also Chit, pure consciousness, which enables all experience and knowledge. But that very same thing, that ultimate reality, is also Ananda, the Sanskrit term for bliss or complete fulfillment. So that's an answer to the question of what is the point of all this? Is there at all a point, and what's the point? So what is real? Sat. How do we know anything at all? All experience is powered by this very Sat, which is Chit or consciousness. And it is also the end of everything, the goal or the purpose of everything. And Advaita Vedanta's, the stunning breakthrough was that this ultimate nature of things, Sat, Chit, Ananda, is you. You, the spiritual seeker, the seeker, all of us. Our real nature is this Sat, Chit, Ananda. So the great formulation in the Upanishads, Tat Tvam Asi, that you are, that the ultimate nature of things, you, the sentient being, you are that. And once we realize this, once we come to know it and we see it as a living reality, at the deepest level, all our problems are solved. So if you are Sat, pure being, you are not born, neither do you die. The fear of death is gone. If you are Chit, you are limitless awareness, all knowledge, all experience. You are that which powers all of it. Because of that, it all happens. And Ananda, bliss, you don't have to seek for fulfillment from little bits of matter and energy floating out there. Rather, you are the point of it all. You meaning that ultimate reality. So this was the grand conclusion of Advaita Vedanta. Now, what do you do about it? Our problem is we don't see it that way. We don't understand ourselves or the universe that way. And Advaita's purpose is to sort of educate us, to shift our paradigm so that we come to see the world and ourselves in that way. And for this, they give methods. And the Advaitic methods are basically sheer philosophy. There are different ways in spiritual life. The most common path in spiritual life is devotion. you believe in a God and you have faith and love God. And so most theistic religions go down that path. There's another path, the path of mystical experience. So there are meditators like Patanjali Yoga, for example, which claims that if you quieten the mind and meditate, you will have some special access to truth. So mystical experiences. Both mystical experiences and the path of belief in God are for pretty valid reasons. They can be easily criticized. They're very difficult to defend if you're not already a believer, if you are in the path of devotion and theistic belief in God, you'll have to face Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens and Daniel Dennett and Richard Dawkins. If you are in the path of mystical experience, any number of neuroscientists can tell you that you may think those things, but either you have a clot or a tumor in your brain, or you are high on psychedelics. It doesn't mean that you are accessing reality. It's just your experience. It could be a personal experience. And that's always been the problem with mystical experience. Though I personally believe mystical experience is genuine and gives us a genuine insight into reality and helpful insight. But all throughout history, it is undeniable. Mystics, even in very religious times, mystics have often been dismissed as crazy people because it's not shared. We don't share it's not a commonly shared understanding or experience. In contrast to mystical experience, in contrast to belief in God, here is the Advaitic approach, which is entirely philosophical, based on reason, and based, most importantly, on our common shared experience. Advaita does not demand of you any kind of belief. It does not demand of you any kind of extraordinary mystical experience. It just demands of you that you're conscious. And then look at the structure of our conscious experience, a subject and an object. And then that's all Advaita needs to begin. And so there are these procedures. I won't go into the procedures. If we are interested, we can take it up, one or two examples later. I'll just enumerate some of them. There is the procedure of subject and object. And so what Advaita does is extraordinarily elegant there. Whatever you experience is an object. That which experiences is a subject. Remember, this is procedural. It's just beginning. It's not the conclusion. So in the beginning, we make a division between the subject and object. We take it seriously and we investigate. And the subject is seen to be consciousness. What is consciousness? A negative definition of consciousness is that to which objects appear. And what is an object? Object is anything that is experienced. A philosopher, Arindam Chakravarti, he gave a very nice definition of an object. An object is anything that objects to my consciousness. Think of consciousness as this field, and it runs up against something which you experience. So it's like something is objecting to your consciousness. So you sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, even thought. Now, when we make this division that whatever you experience is an object, very soon we begin to see that the things we experience in the world out there, they are objects. Nobody denies that. But then our body is an object too. We can see our body, touch, smell, taste our body. We can investigate it with any kind of medical instruments and all of that. And even more stunning, even mind is an object. So thoughts, feelings, emotions, and clearly objects come in two varieties. One is a publicly shared, what you can see around you, and one is a first-person private set of objects called memories, thoughts, pleasure and pain, the very personality itself. So it's why Advaita Vedanta makes a clear distinction between mind and consciousness on the basis of this analytical knife, that mind is also something that appears to consciousness. And therefore, consciousness is just that which illumines all objects. If somebody asks, tell me one thing which consciousness does. Well, it does give us the experience of life itself. I know Christoph Koch named his book on consciousness that, the experience of life itself. First-person experience is what consciousness does. In fact, from Advaitic perspective, the definition of consciousness, experience is consciousness plus object. All right. So this is the first step in Advaita Vedanta. Multiple processes are there, seer and the seen, or the 5 levels of the human personality, the Pancha Kosha, or the waking, dreaming, deep sleep. All of these are procedures to make us appreciate that I am consciousness. I am not a bundle of flesh and thought, but I am consciousness to which appears this entire universe. Now, this is just the first step in Advaita. The second and the last step will be, we ask ourselves this question, yes, I am consciousness to which the whole universe is appearing. Now, the subtle question is, what are these objects which appear to us? Are they distinct? Are they exterior to consciousness? Or are they in some sense interior to consciousness? Now, like, for example, we think that this world is outside me, which would be true if we see it from the perspective of the body. But both the world and the body are experienced in thought, and thoughts are also experienced in consciousness. So when you pursue this line of thought, then the initial distinction which we made to appreciate ourselves as beings of pure consciousness, we begin to see when not only consciousness, but whatever consciousness is aware of, the entire external universe, the entire internal universe of thoughts and emotions and all of that is also not distinct from consciousness. Let me repeat that. It's a very subtle understanding that, yes, it's true that consciousness is distinct from everything that it experiences and illumines, but that which it experiences and illumines is not actually distinct from consciousness, because it's just an abstraction to say that something exists outside consciousness. One more subtle point I'll make here, and then I'll just wrap up. Advaita, by making a distinction between consciousness and mind, makes a distinction between consciousness and knowledge. See, the immediate objection, many objections are there, we can take it up, but immediate objection would be, no, everything is not in consciousness. There are so many things that you don't know, and they exist pretty well without, you, the conscious being. The thing is, everything exists in consciousness either as a tiny slice of what we know, or the rest of it as unknown. The universe appears to consciousness as little bits of knowing and vast seas of the unknown. A good example is our dreams. We don't doubt that whatever we dreamt and whatever was in the world of dreams was dreamt up by this dreaming mind. But phenomenologically, in the dream, just think how it feels. It feels like I know a little bit, I'm in part of a vast world, many things are going on all around me, and I know a little bit which I'm seeing, hearing, and all of that. So the entire world of dreams falls into two parts, which the person in the dream a little bit, which that person knows, and the rest of it is unknown. But when we wake up, all of that was in the dreaming mind. Similarly, Advaita says the entire universe is an object, known and unknown, appearing in consciousness, not distinct from consciousness, not constituting a countable second to consciousness. So it's not actually a second entity apart from consciousness, just as waves are not a countable second apart from water. I mean, you can't count 10,000 waves and water. The moment you say water, all those 10,000 waves are nothing but water. Similarly, all the universe, known and unknown, is nothing but consciousness appearing to itself as its own objects, and therefore not two, non-dual, Advaita. And then the rest of it can be worked out. If this can be seen as a living reality, if our paradigm really shifts to this, then you begin to see how, at least at a deep existential level, our problems are solved. We are immeasurably greater than what we thought we were. And from that perspective, the little life of the body, its ups and downs, and its death are not such enormous disasters as we thought they were, So, yeah, let me rest at that. Advaita is, in one sense, very simple, easy to summarize, because all you need to say is that you are that. Yeah. So this is the classical view, but we need to engage with modern philosophy of mind and science and other schools of thought.
I could sit here and listen to you all day. In less than 20 minutes, I think, with absolute clarity, you just summarized the key to life. And when you come from the woes of Western culture today, and you're facing that all the time, to be confronted with the clarity and simplicity of what is, It's like drinking a glass of water after 3 days in a hot desert. Once, many years ago, I was accused of plagiarizing the Upanishads. And I decided to have a look. I mean, if I was doing that, it was not malicious at all. I didn't want to hijack anybody's culture or philosophy, but I did have a look. I was curious. And it was correct. I was plagiarizing many of the ideas in the Upanishads innocently, without maliciousness and without knowledge. Of course, there is a lot more in the Upanishads than anything I would ever be able to say. The Upanishads have multiple layers of meaning. There is a richness of nuance and subtlety that in the West was perhaps only vaguely approached by the Jungian concept of circumambulation. When you go around the same point, looking at it from different vantage points, so to absorb the entire meaning and significance of what one is trying to hint at. That experience also sort of put me back in my place as a Western analytic philosophy regarding what I could ever hope to achieve. And it reassured me a lot, because when you are one of very few people in the culture that are actively going against the mainstream thinking, of course, there are days you wake up and you have self-doubt. It's like, this to me is so obvious. How come, so many people disagree? I mean, am I crazy? Am I failing to see something here? And the reassurance of texts written, well, at least verbally articulated 3,500 years ago, is just about the best reassurance a human being can get. You sort of relax into your own thoughts, and you know that you are in good company. So my respect for Hinduism has grown significantly, to the point that I started reading about the history of Hinduism. I wanted to know how those people in the Indus Valley, millennia ago, came upon these ideas. Because I felt that kinship, like, I knew more or less how I came upon these ideas. I wanted to know how they did that. And with that degree of richness, nuance, and sophistication. So my relationship, I think, with Hinduism today is one of profound admiration. It's a school of thought that never separated religion from philosophy and philosophy from life. Like we do in the West. Religion is Sunday morning, if at all. Philosophy is 9 to 5, if you are a philosopher. And the rest of the time, it's life. And life isn't religion and isn't philosophy. It's our analytical tendency to try to categorize and put everything in a separate drawer that leads to this schism in the way we relate to ourselves and the world, in which everything is compartmentalized and separate. So that informed me quite a bit, and for this reason, I'm delighted to listen to you today, Swamiji. If someone would have told me 10 years ago that I would be here today with you, I would first not have believed, and if I would have believed, my mind would have blown. So it's a good thing. Now I'm more mature. I can take this without blowing my mind too much.
Thank you for that, Bernardo. I read one book of yours, Why Materialism is Baloney, and I learned as I was reading. I was learning. See, this is the important thing, to think and rethink everything all over for oneself and in one's own age. So, for example, I learned that the peculiar inversion which the dominant materialist paradigm plays on us. So if you talk about spirituality, if you talk about consciousness only, or some form of idealism, you are already at a disadvantage, because it seems you are saying something strange and the burden of proof is upon you. Whereas it is materialism. If you push it a little further, For example, what Bernardo, and I'm taking this entirely from his work, what struck me was, yes, it's true. Instead of idealism, which is making some crazy claim that the world is in consciousness, rather it is materialism which is making that claim. If from the materialist worldview, the entire universe, it actually exists in your head. I mean, it just takes a little bit of thinking what physiology is claiming and what neuroscience is claiming, that your brain generates what we call our first person experience of both consciousness and mind, and therefore everything that you experience is within those processes of the brain. In that case, literally everything that we are experiencing right now is in the body exists, the brain exists, but your experience, your life, everything that you could know or will ever know is a sort of, as he puts it provocatively, hallucination. It's a hallucination in the brain, and all your science and everything has to be based on a trust of that hallucination. So this is another thing which he says, is that if you take the hard problem of consciousness, and one of the outcomes of that, the hard problem of consciousness with the complete worship of matter as the ultimate reality, which means it implies that consciousness is a product of matter. And if you cannot explain how matter is generating consciousness, then you cannot, in principle, say that that consciousness is limited to your brain. If matter is generating consciousness and you don't know how, in that case, consciousness must be some kind of a fundamental property of matter. In that case, everything is consciousness, or at least everything is conscious. So, as he puts it provocatively, your toaster and your, the household appliances, everything, it's not Advaita which is claiming that. It's actually the modern scientific worldview and its implications, which are claiming something that is as crazy as that. In fact, what Advaita is saying the other way around. It says, take your experience seriously. And when it says in consciousness, everything is experienced. That's all it says. And that's literally a true description of what's going on. Yeah, and it's not something that I would have come to. See, the advantage that I have is this already well-established body of thought from the Upanishads down to the modern age. Dozens of great masters have written dozens, if not hundreds of works. And there have been a body of scholars, practitioners, both monastic and lay, who have carried it down to the present age. So it's more like a doctrine, more like a body of work, which I just have to summarize in. But Bernardo's work is much harder. He has to take science seriously, he has to take modern philosophy of mind seriously, and his own intuitions, and sort of do pioneering work, sort of a lonely pioneering work. And the importance of that is, whatever results you come to are immediately acceptable to everybody, because it's no point does it go against established science, and no point does it go against clearly understandable reason and experience. Science, reason, experience, they all come together in what Bernardo is doing.
I appreciate your words very much. If I can comment on some of it, for the past 15 years or so, I have given much thought to why is it so difficult for the Western mentality, which we now have exported to the entire world. It's now in China, it's now in India, it's everywhere. We exported a particular set of axioms. Why is it so difficult for the Western mind to see what is so simple and so clear, such as that the world is in consciousness, everything is happening in consciousness, even what you think of as you is happening in consciousness? Why is it so difficult? And over time, I think I uncovered some understanding of why the Western mind has difficulty with it. And I think one of the fundamental unexamined assumptions that we make is a form of dualism, even when we are promoting a monist metaphysics, such as physicalism, which is supposed to be monist. There is only the physical. To give you some examples, I have been confronted with the following argument against idealism. Bernardo, if I take a needle and I stick it in your arm, that physical event, a needle going into your arm, will cause a mental effect, which is the feeling of pain, which in turn will make you withdraw your arm. So there is obviously an arrow of causation that starts from physical events and go into mental events. If you drink a glass of whiskey, something will change in your conscious inner life. So the arrow of causation comes from physical events to mental events. Therefore, mental events are secondary and physical events are primary. Of course, the misunderstanding here is that it is a form of dualism. It is this distinction between physical events and mental events. And neither physicalism, when understood correctly, nor idealism, when understood correctly, makes these distinctions. For the idealist, that needle going into your arm is a process in consciousness. It is a mental event, mental in the Western sense. It is a mental event that just appears to your observation as a needle going into your arm, but it isn't physical. The physicality of it is an appearance. It's a cognitive representation on the screen of perception. The event itself is a mental event, which then causes another mental event, the feeling of pain. But it's very difficult for the Western mind to sort of re-examine its deepest assumptions and realize that a lot of things we take for granted about what's going on, those very things are what is being questioned and what needs to be questioned for us to get to some form of sanity. And there are many other examples of this that I see all around me, like even one of the names you cited, Sam Harris. He was in a podcast, I think last year or the year before, and he was asked by Lex Friedman about idealism. And he gave a dismissive reply based on the notion that it's absurd to think that the entire universe is in your mind. Well, it is absurd, but that's not what idealism says. Idealism is not saying that the entire universe is in your personal mind, corresponding to that entity in consciousness called a body. What idealism says is that the world is a mental process. So a mental in the Western sense, in the West, mind and consciousness, they both arise from the Greek psyche, which also means so we don't have introspective, we haven't had historically enough introspective sophistication to come up with different words for the different aspects of what we are talking about. So forgive my coarse language. I use the word mental in the Western sense, meaning conscious process as well. So the world is mental in that sense. It's a process in consciousness, but not in your ego alone, not in your individual mind alone. There is a transpersonal form of consciousness that, in fact, you are that. You don't think you are that, but the thing you think you are is a segment of that transpersonal form of consciousness. Therefore, the world is really out there from the ego's perspective. It's not under the control of the ego's whims and fantasies. It's really external in that sense, but it is nonetheless still mental. Just like the thoughts of another person are external to your personal mind, but they are still mental, and you can't control them, but they are still mental. So these subtle, simple understandings is what catches the Western mind, because it doesn't investigate what it doesn't know it's doing. If it doesn't know it's making these a priori assumptions, it can't investigate them. It can't critically examine them. And that colors everything else that the Western mind is trying to make sense of, and leads to all kinds of misunderstandings, like Sam Harris misunderstanding idealism as a form of solipsism. And that's a great tragedy.
And let me just interject here that what you are advocating, the form of idealism, kind of refined and well-examined idealism, at no point contradicts science. And scientific materialistic reductionist worldview is one thing, but the beauty of it is it's not anti-scientific. Every scientific discovery and process and technology would be as valid and as effective in your worldview, and it would also have the advantage of explaining or integrating consciousness and mind. And isn't that true?
That's absolutely true. I mean, if somebody comes up with a metaphysics that says if you drop an object, it will fall up and not down, then one's metaphysics is simply wrong. And I mean, I have many shortcomings, but I'm not that stupid to propose something that contradicts true observation. The problem is that many of us conflate axiomatic assumptions for empirical observations. For instance, we think that the existence of a strictly physical world outside mind is an empirical observation. It's not. Whatever you observe, it's an experience on the screen of perception, and it's not separate from mind. It's your account of that experience that leads to the abstraction of a world outside mind. That's not an empirical observation, but we mix it up. We think, for instance, that materialism underlies science, and it's an integral part of the scientific method. It's not. Science studies nature's behavior, not what nature is. When you set up an experiment, nature responds in the form of a behavior. Nature does something in response to your experimental conditions. And that's what science tries to model and predict. Science tries to predict what nature will do next. It doesn't make statements about what the nature is. Whenever there is a statement in science about what nature is, it's a convenient fiction. For instance, Newton said, there is this invisible force of gravity that attracts the moon and the earth and locks them, one in the orbit of another. That's a convenient fiction. It means nature behaves as if there were such a force. But then 300 years later, Einstein came around, and that convenient fiction was no longer convenient. There is no such invisible force. There is something else. There is the invisible fabric of space-time that bends and twists, and that's why the moon orbits the earth. But that still is a convenient fiction, because now with loop quantum gravity, there is no such a thing as fundamental time. Time is now derivative. It's epiphenomenal. It's not in the fabric of nature itself. So convenient fictions change over time. They give us a way to think about our predictive models, but they are not metaphysical statements. So science doesn't change at all because our metaphysical understanding of what is has evolved. But it's hard for people to see this.
Right. These two things, that the known and the unknown are both in consciousness, and subject and object are also both in consciousness. So it's not an individual subject which dreams up the entire objective universe. Our senior most member here, Bill Conrad, he's 98. He's a veteran of the Second World War. He used to fly bombers on the Pacific Theater. He said to me, "No, Swami, you're not right. The world doesn't exist in your consciousness. The world exists, and you come as a conscious being and you experience it. And I can prove it to you." So he says, "Let's put a camera in this room and switch it on. And then both you and I, we can leave this room, and then we come back in. And I assure you, when you look at the pictures in the camera, you will see an empty room without any conscious beings. So that proves that the room exists without your consciousness or my consciousness." And I said to him, "Bill, in your consciousness, in your awareness, you thought about this experiment. In your awareness, in awareness itself, we put up this camera. And in your awareness, we left the room. And in your awareness, you came back into the room. And in your awareness, you saw the picture showing an empty room. At which point have you or I stepped outside awareness to experience things?" And of course, there's no answer to this. It's a trick question. It's a trivial question. If experience is consciousness plus object, then there's no possibility of experiencing anything without consciousness. I mean, you can extend this question quite far. People ask, but consciousness is a late product. You know, the universe existed billions of years, and then life evolved, and then in life, matter evolved into living brains and nervous systems, and it generated an epiphenomenon consciousness, which is a very Johnny-come-lately. How can that be prior to the universe? But all of this A universe existing without consciousness is something that we are talking about in consciousness. This is the thing. The dream example is really used in Advaita Vedanta to explain this. In dreams, we are both the subject and the object, because we imagine a world in our dreams. There are people and places and things happening, but we are also there in our own dreams. We are a person in our own dream. And that person in the dream is not imagining the world of the dreams. In fact, the world of the dream and that person are both appearing in the dreamer's mind. So exactly like that, both nature and the sentient beings experiencing nature are appearances in consciousness. Here, I would just quickly introduce multiple world views and consciousness and self views which are available in Indian philosophy, and maybe get your reaction to that. So Advaita is not the only school. There are others which have talked about it differently. So Sankhya, for example, is a strict dualism. Material entities exist, the material universe exists, and consciousness is also a fundamental reality, and they interact. And the interaction is, for example, here in this body-mind. Bodies and minds are all provided by nature, and you are consciousness, and you interact with this and become this sentient being, Sarvapriyananda or Bernardo. That's one view. The other view is a whole philosophy called Kashmiri Shaivism, which says, no, the material universe is not separate from consciousness. In fact, consciousness is dynamic, and consciousness produces or sort of extends itself or evolves into mind and material entities, like almost exactly the language you use, like whirlpools. And a particular whirlpool is a mind and a brain and a body. So consciousness evolves down to the mental and the physical, including the physical universe. It is all one consciousness. And the third worldview would be the Advaitic view that dynamism does not belong to consciousness. Dynamism, change, evolution, production, all of those appear to consciousness and are experienced because of consciousness. Just like a movie screen or a mirror doesn't change into what is, like the villain and the hero of the movie and the action in the movie. They are all appearances on the screen. Just as the dreaming mind doesn't actually become trees and plants and men and women and all of that in the dream, they all appear in the dreaming mind, the mind remaining the mind. So consciousness does not evolve, is not dynamic, is not static either. Being changing, unchanging, time, space, all of them appear in consciousness and to consciousness, and are not a second reality apart from consciousness. Both Kashmiri Shaivism and Advaita are monisms in certain senses. Advaita is very strictly non-dualism, only consciousness and everything appearing in consciousness. And Kashmiri Shaivism is also monism. It's only consciousness, but that consciousness is dynamic and changing and doing all these things. I don't know, where would you, at present, the way you are thinking now, where would you come down?
I don't know whether my particular view is of much significance in view of the entire history behind these traditions, but I will share it for what it's worth. I think there are different levels of concession to language. How much do we concede to the structure of language? And we allow the structure of language to define the structure of our metaphysics. Of course, metaphysics has nothing to do with language, but our thoughts have. And therefore, when we think about metaphysics, we almost unavoidably impart on our metaphysics the structure of our language, because we think in language. So how far is one willing to concede to that linguistic structure? I think dualism makes a lot of concessions to linguistic structures, because in language you have verb and noun, action and existent. You have subject and object, the experiencer and the thing experienced. You have past and future. So language is filled with these seeming dualisms, which exist experientially. I would argue not metaphysically, but there is something happening in our minds that we can legitimately, more or less legitimately label as past and future, subject and object, noun and verb, and so on. If we concede that, then a form of dualism is acceptable, although not ultimately true. Things happen as if there were a past and a future, a subject and an object. If somebody shoots the wall behind me, I don't feel it. If somebody shoots me, I do feel it. But these dualisms do not necessarily need to be fundamental. And what we are looking for is what exists fundamentally in nature and what is epiphenomenal, what is caused, what is reducible, what is explainable in terms of the fundamentals. And dualism, I think, ultimately can be explained in terms of fundamental things that are non-dual. So if you're not willing to make that much concession to language, then you go back to, okay, everything is then consciousness, but stuff is happening. So I gave up the dualism of subject and object, but I don't give up the dualism of past and future, because if I talk about evolution, evolution means a change of states in time. So I'm granting that part of linguistic structure when I talk about consciousness evolving. I'm granting time. I'm also granting some distinction between verb and noun, because now I say there is only one noun, it's consciousness, and everything else is verb. Everything else are unfolding events, doings of consciousness, verbs, actions. And that for most people today, I think, is the minimum degree of concession that one has to make, because otherwise it becomes too uncomfortable for people to ask them to not think in terms of time and a distinction between things and events and actions. It's very hard. But if you ask my personal opinion is absolute non-dualism. There is no time, therefore nothing actually evolves. If you think carefully about it, the past is a memory experienced now. The future is an expectation experienced now. They are never anything other than that. Therefore, they exist in the now. But the now is infinitely short. If you want to pin it down by saying now, by the time my lips begin to move, it's already gone. It's in the past. So the present contains everything, but it's not long enough for anything to actually happen. So nothing ever actually happens. And that is the great universal magic in which everything comes out of absolutely nothing. And I think it's true. That's the magic of existence. Nothing ever happens. Nothing ever happened. Nothing will ever happen. There is nothing. But in that nothing, there is everything. There is the concreteness of an era of time, a concreteness of an object, a concreteness of things that happen, the entire dance of life and death. But it's impossible to convey this to people in analytic terms. So a concession needs to be made at the level of culture, not at the level of personal insight. At the level of culture, a concession needs to be made. So I'm willing in my work to make the concession that there is such a thing as evolution, and it's not an insincere concession, because I think in eternity, outside of time, there is something ineffable that when projected onto time, we call evolution.
Yes.
In other words, evolution itself doesn't exist, but it's an image of something that does. We can't access the thing in itself. We can only access its shadow, its projection on time. So it's valid to talk about evolution so long as we keep in mind that it's not fundamental. It's a symbol. It's hinting at something that cannot be talked about and which itself is not evolving. But there are properties to that thing that when projected onto time, we call an evolution of the world's states, or an evolution of an individual's mind, or the evolution of culture, the evolution of the species. So it's not invalid, but it's not ultimately true. So I think ultimately I remain with the Upanishads. Yeah. I hope my friend Rupert Spira doesn't get too upset with me. He's a Kashmiri Shaivinist. But I think ultimately, yeah, it's the Upanishad. I think people in Hindus Valley 3,500 years ago hit upon something that is hair-raisingly undeniable, but is very difficult to talk about.
Yes, beautifully put. I couldn't put that better myself. But when you say nothing exists, the Advaitin would sort of jump in and there and would like to say, well, but Bernardo is not talking about nihilism. He's the way Advaitin would put in is no thing exists.
Yeah.
So yeah, these discrete changing bits of matter, time, space, they are not ultimately real. And it's also interesting the concession that Bernardo is making to in a way it's a concession to practicality also, and that is something that the great non-dualists, they also came to this idea that even when you teach non-dualism, you must make a space for what they call conventional truth or relative truth. Even the great Nagarjuna, the Buddhist teacher of emptiness, he says that the Buddha taught two truths, an absolute truth and a conventional truth. And then he says, without resorting to conventional truth, nobody comes to that absolute truth. So all your science, philosophy, society, everything takes conventional truth seriously. Even spirituality takes conventional truth seriously in order to come to the insight of non-dualism. It's also interesting that in the history of Indian philosophy, so early on there were these absolute realists, the Nyaya school, which thought that there's a physical separate world out there, and of course there's God and there are selves, and language is that which reveals reality. For them, language is trustworthy because it reveals reality. And then all the subsequent schools, whether the Kashmiri Shaivas, the Buddhists, and the Advaitins and all, they all built upon criticizing this naive realist view of the Naiyayikas. They became suspicious of language. I think as philosophy develops, you see that everywhere. The criticism of a critique of language, a sophisticated investigation into how language functions and what it does and what it cannot do, and the illusions it generates. The Hindus came upon this with the Advaita critique of language. The Buddhists came upon this with the Madhyamaka and especially the Madhyamaka critique of language. And in Western philosophy also we see, in the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries, it almost entirely became about language with Wittgenstein and others.
That's absolutely true, yeah.
True. And it's interesting how these two parallel developments of Indian philosophy, the Hindu Advaitic side and the Buddhist schools in the Nalanda school, and later on its developments in Tibet and in China and other places, they came to remarkably same conclusions. On paper, they seem to be absolute opposites. Self, no self. God, no God. It seems to talk about, Advaita seems to talk about some permanent eternal reality, and Buddhism says that such a thing cannot exist. And yet if you look at the language, the methodology, and the conclusions about world, self, ultimate reality, they almost seem, if not exactly the same, sometimes exactly the same verses are used, but they seem like mirror images. I know classical Tibetan Buddhist scholars, Tibetan and Indian, and classical Advaita scholars will not agree on this. They still hold on to a 1,000-year debate between Hinduism and Buddhism. But if you just step back a little, it seems they're literally talking about the same thing.
Yeah, language creates ghosts, and
Yes.
And ghosts have tremendous domain over our thinking. It's amazing. There's something you said in the beginning when you opened up. You were talking about the hard problem of consciousness, which is, if I articulate it rigorously, the idea behind the hard problem is that there is nothing about physical properties in terms of which we could deduce the qualities of experience in principle. In other words, there's nothing about charge, momentum, spin, mass, geometrical relationships, in terms of which we could, in principle, deduce what it feels like to eat an orange, to fall in love, or to have a bellyache. And that's a linguistic issue. The heart problem is a linguistic problem because, in other words, it doesn't exist. There is no heart problem in nature. A problem only arises because of our deluded accounts of nature. The problem exists only in our accounts. And it goes like this. At some point during the Renaissance, early Enlightenment, early Western scientists or proto-scientists realized that it's very useful to describe the sensed world in terms of quantities. So if you say, if my piece of luggage weighs 50 kilos, I will know what it will feel like to lift it as opposed to a piece of luggage that weighs 5 kilos. Or if the next town is 100 kilometers away, I will know something about what it will feel like going there than if the next town is 1 kilometer away. So quantities, 100, 1, 5, 50, they are very useful to describe the world of perceptions. But then the West tried to replace the world of perceptions with the quantities and say, what really exists out there are the 50 kilos, the 100 kilometers, and what it feels like to lift the piece of luggage, or what it feels like to walk to the next town. These are epiphenomenal. This is something your brain constructs inside your head. It's not out there. What is out there are the numbers, not the qualities. The qualities are made up inside your head. And then we get confused when we cannot, in principle, deduce the qualities from the numbers. Now, why is that? It's a linguistic problem because the numbers only have meaning in the context of the things they describe. The difference between 5 and 50 kilos only has meaning given the feeling of lifting the piece of luggage. The difference between 100 or 1 kilometer only has meaning given the experience of walking to the next town. But if you say the numbers precede the experience, in other words, the numbers have to exist prior to the thing the numbers describe, then the semantic reference that gives the numbers their meaning disappears. And now you have numbers floating in a vacuum. They mean nothing. And if they mean nothing, of course, we cannot deduce anything from them. Ergo, the hard problem. It's so silly. You know, we come up with stuff that only has meaning in a context. Then we remove this stuff from their semantic context. And we get surprised that they don't have meaning, that we can't deduce anything from them. It's just language. I mean, one day people will look back at our dilemma today and they will laugh and they will think, how did these idiots come to this nonsense? How could they believe? How could they be so confused?
I think, I never thought of it that way. What you did was actually more rigorous and more precise pointing out of the problem. I saw sort of a simpler description of this. The philosopher Galen Strawson, he wrote this article, The Hard Problem of Matter, sort of half serious, half cheeky in the New York Times. And there he said that, you know, the hard problem exists only because we have made up our minds everything is matter. And now we can't imagine how the matter in the brain generates consciousness, ergo the hard problem. Yeah. So he says really the real hard problem is what is matter, because matter appears to consciousness, and then when you investigate what matter is, it vanishes. It's continuously vanishing before our very eyes. But what you did was, it's a more precise philosophical analysis of it. Yeah.
I'm forced into this, into being very explicit and precise. Otherwise, my colleagues just say that, oh, okay, Bernardo is an idiot. So I have to come up with this stuff. But what did I want to say? We confuse empirical experience with abstraction. We think abstraction is an empirical given. And for instance, when it comes to the word matter that you just used, there are two things that we mean by that word. One is colloquial matter. For instance, my bottle here is made of matter. I use the word matter to refer to the particular concrete experience of holding and seeing this metal bottle. So there is colloquial matter, meaning the contents of the screen of perception, which of course are mental. Perceptions are mental is mental stuff. I mean, consciousness stuff. But we colloquially apply the word matter to it. Now, in that use, matter is undeniable. Denying colloquial matter is denying perceptual experience. Nobody's going to do that. Nobody sane is going to do that. But then we use the word matter in the strict philosophical sense, meaning matter is that which exists behind and beyond experience, and which somehow gives rise to and modulates experience. Matter is that which is purely quantitative and has no inherent qualities. Now you have a philosophical definition of matter, and you can deny that. You can say this abstraction is unnecessary and it's false. We can account for nature without this abstraction. The problem is when somebody like me comes up and says, I deny matter defined in the rigorous way, people think, oh, Bernardo, you're an idiot. How can you deny the metal bottle? Well, that's matter in the colloquial sense. We are talking about something else, but people conflate everything. And they think that the denial of philosophical matter is the denial of perceptual experience, which it's not. Confusion reigns.
I think and again, language and conventional usage. That's why in all the non-dualisms, like Madhyamaka Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta, they always have these two levels of conventional truth and absolute truth. And all matter of usage and practice is at the level of conventions, and there you accept it. The Sanskrit etymology might be interesting here. Matter in Sanskrit and most Indian languages, the word is jada. Jada means that which appears to consciousness. So that which consciousness experiences is matter. You can't leave consciousness out of the definition of matter.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. May I ask you a couple of questions?
Yes, please do.
Which may not have much to do with the discussion we already had, but since I'm here with you, I can't help but want to use the opportunity. In your intro, you talked about bliss. So in the sense that, okay, there is something that exists, it is consciousness, and it entails bliss. My question is, because this resonates with the Christian problem of evil, is the fundamental nature of reality or the Godhead fundamentally and inherently good, or does it also have what we would call bad properties or evil properties? So my question is, under Advaita Vedanta, is this bliss just a relative experience once we see through the delusions that make us suffer in life? In other words, if I am deluded that I am this small little thing condemned to death, whose life has no meaning, whatever happens or doesn't happen, if that's what I believe in life, then I'm causing suffering to myself. And if I get rid of the source of that delusion, then I will come to a state that, relative to the state I was in before, it is blissful. So relative to the suffering of life, it's blissful. Or is that state inherently blissful in an absolute way?
I'll say it's neither. The idea of bliss in Advaita Vedanta, let's put it this way. When the formulation is Sat, Chit, Ananda, Sat being pure existence, Chit pure consciousness, Ananda pure bliss. Now, analogously, when you say Sat or pure being, you don't mean existing things. So you mean existence itself. Just as when you say a necklace or a bracelet, you don't mean gold. But the gold can be experienced as a necklace or a bracelet or a ring, but need not be. There's nothing in the gold which suggests a necklace or a bracelet. Gold is just gold. Similarly, being, a pure being, is just being. And existing things, however, depend upon pure being, because they borrow their existence from pure being. So being itself is not an existing thing. Similarly, pure consciousness is not conscious experiences. So pure consciousness does not mean seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. However, the reverse is not true. There can be no seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching without that pure consciousness. Similarly, bliss, ananda, is not a particular feeling of being happy or, it's all nice and pleasant, but all feelings of fulfillment, happiness, bliss, the entire range of it depends upon this ananda. So it's a difference between seeing your face in the mirror and the real face. Now, the face in the mirror has the advantage of actually being perceivable, an experienced object, but it has the disadvantage of not being real. That's not the ultimate reality. Ultimate reality is here, but it doesn't appear. Similarly, pure being can be experienced as existing things, but not as pure being. Pure consciousness is that which can be experienced as all conscious experiences, first-person experiences. But in itself, pure consciousness is not a particular experience. Similarly, pure bliss is not, one very fantastic kind of bliss. Rather, that's what gives all meaning, purpose, and fulfillment to life itself. Another way of putting it would be the very appreciation of your limitless being consciousness is bliss. I'm translating from the Upanishad. The definition of Brahman in Taittiriya Upanishad is limitless existence awareness. Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma. Brahman is the ultimate reality, and it is limitless being, limitless awareness. This limitlessness of our being awareness is bliss. Once we appreciate that. Now, what does all this philosophical stuff mean in practical terms? So if you really see it that way, would you be happy or not? That's the cash value of the whole thing. The answer is yes. If you look at the lives of enlightened people, they were in a sense of actually felt happiness. They were very happy people because, as the Upanishads put it, as Vedanta puts it, you have the sense of having done what was to be done in life, having known what was to be known in life, and having gotten what was to be gotten in life. The whole purpose, the point of it comes to a culmination when you realize this limitless, your own limitless nature. Why would you not be happy? Even in the sense of felt happiness, felt fulfillment. And that felt happiness and fulfillment would no longer be dependent on circumstances. I, this little being, I'm going to be happy if things around me are nice and people around me are nice. No, not like that anymore. Irrespective of whatever circumstances, you see the same limitless existence everywhere and in every experience, and therefore you are happy, even in a felt sense, even in the sense of the way we use happiness. That also would be there.
Can there be a state of consciousness that does not entail any experience, any quality? Because some meditators say, well, there is a state that I think Buddhists call the void.
Yes.
Which would mean being in a state of consciousness in which there are no experiences. But at the same time, they come back and report on it. So they experienced something that they are calling the void.
Yes.
How do you make sense of it?
In Advaita, first we will say that there are no states of consciousness. Whatever appears to consciousness in consciousness, those are states. So states of the world which we experience, states of our inner world like waking, dreaming, deep sleep. So Advaita would say these are not states of consciousness, these are states of the mind which appears in consciousness. The mind can be awake, mind can be dreaming, mind can be in deep sleep. So consciousness is one and constant and non-dual. Now there are states in meditation. So meditation is a condition of the mind, not of consciousness, where the mind is fully awake and yet completely stilled. So it's not breaking out into waves, experiencing sensory inputs. It's not even generating dreams within, but it's not even asleep. It has not withdrawn into a kind of hibernation. So it's alert, very alert, and yet not breaking into waves and experiences. And that state of absorption is called samadhi, and it's a yogic practice. The Advaitin would simply say, it's the same consciousness which illumines that state. The variety of experiences in waking state is illumined and is appearing to and in the same consciousness, as are the internal states of dreams and deep sleep, also the blankness of deep sleep, and yogic trances and absorptions. The value of yogic trances and absorptions is you are turning the mind as much as possible towards the ultimate nature of things. So instead of reflecting a world of appearances outside or a world of appearances in your mind, it's quote unquote reflecting your real nature. It's the best that the mind turned inwards in samadhi, in these yogic meditation states, is probably the best mirror in which to see yourself. One way of looking at it is consciousness is experiencing itself in a variety of mirrors. The mirror of our sensory experience is one. The mirror of our thoughts and understanding is one. But the mirror of the highest meditative states is probably the best mirror. But all these mirrors and experiences are appearing to one and the same consciousness. The man on the street who has no interest in philosophy, science, or non-dualism, and the highest non-dual meditator in the mountains of Tibet or in the forests of India, they are all being powered by one and the same consciousness, which is what we are.
So samadhi is the fairest mirror. Is that a
that would be, I never used that term earlier, but I guess I just came up with it now. But it's the best mirror. Vivekananda says, he says that the only thing that we can do is polish the mirror. It's a cryptic statement. The only thing that we can do is polish the mirror, which is polish our personality, this is our moral and ethical life, and our power of attention, and our power of understanding. So this moral and ethical life, power of attention, and our understanding, appreciation of what reality is, all come together, and they can give you a glimpse of the best possible glimpse. But even that glimpse is made possible because of that same consciousness. Yeah.
So there is something it is like to be in samadhi. It's not completely empty. It's just empty of everything else that isn't samadhi.
Yes. There is. It's also a first-person experience, but very different from every other first-person experience, because every other first-person experience is interpreted in and through mind. So when the mind is stilled, that also is a first-person experience. And that's why you can also report something about it. So the way Sri Ramakrishna describes it is illumined by illumination. Other times what happens is consciousness illumines thoughts in the mind, understandings in the mind, perceptions garnered by senses. But here all of that has been stilled. So the illumination is sort of self-illumined there, or self-revealed there. Even there the mind persists, but in its best. Sri Ramakrishna puts it in this way: pure mind, pure consciousness are one there.
So Swamiji, would it be contentless then? Would you say a contentless state?
Oh, certainly
not cognitive experience.
Certainly contentless. That's already that they have already emptied their mind of mind formations. So it stops. No sensory input, no generation of thoughts from within, and yet no sleep either. They have not fallen, the mind hasn't shut down either. It's stilled. There are various ways of coming to it. In fact, devotional practices, Christian mysticism, Islamic mysticism, and the many kinds of Hindu devotional mysticism, it can bring you to that state. Or non-theistic.
Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, a non-theistic. It could be a completely yogic approach or a Buddhistic approach, which makes no ontological commitment to God. Just purify the mind, still the mind, and you will get a glimpse of this truth. It's still a glimpse. It's still not the truth itself, because you are the truth. And it's great that you cannot be objected. The only way we can objectify ourselves is this. So in one sense, the entire experience of life, from the most quotidian daily sensory experiences up to samadhi, is basically this limitless consciousness trying or objectifying itself. In India, in Vedanta and yoga, there is an ancient debate. What is the way to enlightenment? Is it samadhi, meditation leading to samadhi, or is it philosophical inquiry, vichara? The Advaitins would stress this philosophical inquiry. You are that already, and ignorance is what covers it up. And so an inquiry will destroy this ignorance if you take a good hard look at what you are. The yogis will say the real problem is the restlessness of the mind. The truth is always shining. Calm the mind, and you will know what you are. There's one commentary by a great Advaitic master, Madhusudana, who says there are two kinds of mental constitutions. One can benefit from samadhi, the other can benefit from philosophical inquiry.
So just now I feel guilty, so I'll ask just one more question relatively quickly. It is a popular interpretation amongst Westerners that Eastern philosophical traditions, such as Advaita Vedanta, and maybe Buddhism as well, that the idea there is that life with its suffering, it's some kind of cosmic error, some kind of cosmic mistake. And that the best way to go about it is to try to get out of it, to live life. I personally don't see things that way. To use the language you just used, I see life as a variety of mirrors, and even though they are distorted and they are based on delusion, they are still mirrors. There is still a meaning inherent to experiencing oneself through the walls of delusion and confusion in our culture. How do you see that? Is this whole thing an error that should be corrected?
That's certainly the language used in classical Advaita Vedanta and in classical Buddhism and other philosophies also. Swami Vivekananda, however, he said we proceed not from error to truth, but from lower truth to higher truth. That was Vivekananda's formulation. And I just say this, notice the ideal in these paths. What are they aiming at? In Advaita Vedanta is called Jivan Mukta, enlightened while living. Not a perfect heaven after death or some kind of freedom after death or after samadhi. Right here in this life, with this insight, with this living enlightenment, you continue in this life, live life. And look at the ideal in Mahayana Buddhism. That's the bodhisattva, who doesn't want to disappear into nirvana, but is continuously, not only one lifetime after lifetime, is continuously engaged in life, but from an enlightened perspective. So in both of these developments of Indian philosophy, it's not life denying. It's in fact an enlightened life which they're looking for, from lower truth to higher truth.
Well, Hari Om Swamiji, Hari Om, and hi Bernardo. I don't have any question per se, but just want to know from Bernardo, do the Western approach segregate between consciousness as an entity and consciousness as an operating parameter or an operating entity? Is there any difference between these two, or there is only one consciousness which is being considered?
Under analytic idealism, consciousness would be the only thing that actually exists. Well, it isn't a thing either. And whatever words I use to describe it will ultimately beg the question. Like I could describe it, and I do often, as a spatially unbound experiential field. In other words, a field that is constituted of the potential for experience, but experiences themselves would be patterns of excitation of the field. Experiences would be actions or behaviors of consciousness. And the thing that behaves, which is not a thing, would be consciousness. And it would be the only existent. And it would have inherent properties or inherent dispositions towards certain behaviors, because it is what it is and it's not what it's not. And there you could find back the archetypes of Jungian psychology, for instance, or Plato's ideal forms, which is another way to talk about the same thing. And if I dare be so bold in the presence of Swamiji, that's the same idea behind the polytheistic aspect of Indian philosophy. The archetypes of Brahman, the inherent dispositions or the potential patterns of behavior of Brahman. In other words, the many gods and goddesses are doings, and the only thing that actually exists, the doer, is Brahman, itself. I don't know how Swamiji will regard what I just said. It's probably inaccurate.
It's a new insight to me, and I think it's a beautiful way of putting it. Patterns of excitation or behavior in consciousness. Advaita would immediately shy away from this. Kashmiri Shaivism would be delighted if you say this. And I noticed this connection between the multiple forms of Brahman, the forms and qualities which are imposed on Brahman in the various gods and goddesses in Hinduism. What struck me was, that's interesting, because when you take away even the concept of God, and you have something like Buddhism, even there you have to generate a whole array of deities who represent various kinds of, you might call them Jungian archetypes. So the Jungian archetypes, the gods and goddesses in Hinduism, and the range of deities which display different kinds of power and grace in Tibetan Buddhism. Very interesting connection. And if you want to give it a very neutral description, I can't suggest anything better than what Bernardo just said. These are patterns of excitation in consciousness.
Yeah, when I say excitation, I say this knowing to some extent that I'm conceding something to language, because if there is no time, there are no patterns of excitations fundamentally.
Correct.
But there is something in eternity that when projected onto time can be described as patterns of excitation. So it's in that spirit that I say this, not
Absolutely.
that I think there is a scaffolding of objective space-time out there and events unfolding. I don't actually think that. But even in Christianity, we have this polytheistic element. I mean, it starts with the Trinity, the Holy Trinity, which also is there in Hinduism. Brahma,
Vishnu and Maheshwara.
Yeah. And then we have in Catholicism the saints, which is a form of polytheism that you find right back there as well.
Now, one clarification to Swamiji. You said samadhi is not sleep. But will it not be contradicting Chandogya, where it says Sati Sampadya na viduhu Sati Sampadya Maye, where having become one with the existence in the deep sleep, we do not know we have attained that. So samadhi and deep sleep in experiential point of view is identical. But when you said samadhi is not sleep, I was a bit confused.
Yes, and samadhi is not sleep, but what you have pointed out is the metaphysics of sleep and samadhi. I was talking about the practice of yogic samadhi. So the practice of yogic samadhi, for example, is not falling asleep. You must not fall asleep. You must be absolutely alert and then empty the mind of its contents, or chitta vritti. The movements of the mind must be stilled. However, what you have said here is from the Chandogya Upanishad, where what they are saying is, notice, we do not know what we have attained in deep sleep. So that's the characteristic of deep sleep. If deep sleep were samadhi, all of us would be enlightened. The moment you go into deep sleep and then you come out of it, you would be enlightened. But that doesn't happen. We do not know what we have attained in deep sleep, but we have attained to our real nature. And that goes very deep into the causal nature. See, Advaita Vedanta talks about a physical nature, which is sthula or physical, this waking world, a subtle nature, which is most prominent in our dreams, and a causal nature, which is most prominent in our deep sleep. Samadhi is sort of parallel to that, where you withdraw from the external world of activity and sensation into the internal world of thought forms, that you also still into what? It can only be that causal state. But if you do it consciously, when you do it awake, then that experience comes where you have, quote unquote, an experience of your real nature as pure consciousness. So yeah, practically from a sadhana perspective, samadhi and sleep are very different. Sleep, you just have to fall asleep or you take a sleeping pill. And samadhi is an arduous process, a difficult process of discipline over a long period of time till you begin to get some glimpses. But metaphysically, they're both pointing to the causal state, karanavastha. Neither actually are pointing to that which is beyond the causal state, which is you, the real you. But that's the closest you can get.
Yeah. Namaskaram to everyone, and Namo Buddhaya, Swamiji and Bernardo. So, my observation is that since you guys discussed about the void in Buddhism, which is shunyata, in my opinion, shunyata is inconceivability of things, or nirtsvabhava. And my question is, what is, in your understanding, this void in Buddhism or shunyata in Buddhism is, and how much of it has helped each of you in your seeking of truth? And since we are also discussing deep sleep, particularly to Swamiji, I would like to ask, is there a connection between shunyata and deep sleep?
Let me start there. Deep sleep, I would like to characterize it as not an absence of experience, but an experience of absence. And Rupert Spira also uses a similar language, I found out. It's the ancient Sanskrit texts, for example, Panchadashi also mentions deep sleep as an experience of absence. So its experience does not stop in deep sleep also. Now, your question about emptiness, it's not a central concept in Advaita Vedanta, but it's a central concept in Buddhism, especially Mahayana Buddhism, and especially the developments in Tibetan Buddhism, in Madhyamaka, and also the Chittamatra mind-only school. I have been fascinated by it, so that's why it played a role, if not in my spiritual development, in my intellectual development, certainly. I've been fascinated by it for about 30 years now, when I first came across Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamaka Karika. Yes, as you characterized it, shunyata, the classical definition in Buddhism, is niswabhava, emptiness of self-nature. Another definition Nagarjuna gives is what is meant by the interdependence, pratitya samutpada. That is what we mean by emptiness. Again, emptiness of self-nature. I'll just say this. I did a lot of reading, but I'm not an initiated Buddhist, nor have I done the actual practices that, for example, a Tibetan Buddhist would go through, the tantric practices. I did a lot of academic reading, let's just say. And I still was not very confident that I have understood, I've got clarity about shunyata. But recently, a book was brought to my notice by Jackson Peterson, who is a Tibetan Buddhist teacher in US and other countries. It's a small book. It's called Progressive Stages of Meditation on Emptiness. Progressive Stages of Meditation on Emptiness. It's written by Sultrim Gyatso Rinpoche, a Tibetan master, a contemporary. Short book. What it does is, it takes up the concept of emptiness in 5 stages. The Theravada, or the Shravaka concept of emptiness, and the related practices and its benefits. Second, the mind-only, the Mahayana Chittamatra school, the mind-only school, its concept of emptiness and the meditation and benefits. Then the Madhyamaka school, the middle path school, with 2 varieties, the Swatantrika and the Prasangika variety. The Prasangika variety, which is the dominant form, which is basically what His Holiness Dalai Lama, the Gelug school, all of them, in fact, all the Tibetan schools would claim that we are Prasangika Madhyamaka. Concept of emptiness there, and related meditation and its benefits. And finally, he brings in the Shentong school, which is a little known school. It was sort of suppressed in the history of the development of Tibetan Buddhism. And the Gelug school with the Prasangika Madhyamaka. Prasangika Madhyamaka is the philosophy, and the practitioners were the other schools of Tibetan Buddhism, especially the Gelug school, which is led by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And its leader is traditionally the leader of all the Tibetan Buddhists. But there was another group of monks called the Jonang school, the Jonang monastery, and they practiced the Shentong kind of Mahayana Buddhism. They called themselves Mahamadhyamaka, the great Madhyamakas. And there, if you see the description of emptiness, if you see it in that book, the description of emptiness, this is just literally the same description of pure consciousness or pure being in Advaita Vedanta. So there it's sort of resolved, at least to my mind. My feeling is the shunyata approach, the emptiness approach, and the Advaita approach, they are different approaches. One should not conflate them. And so that's a beauty. If you have got 2 different approaches which lead you to a non-dual realization, that's the beauty. But my feeling is they're both pointing to the same non-dual realization.
Thank you.
So thank you, Swamiji, for that wonderful answer. Yeah. So the same question I would like to pose to Bernardo as well. Like, because he mentioned first the, about void in Buddhism in his question to Swamiji, and that's why I want to ask Bernardo as well. Like, what is his understanding of shunyata, or the void in Buddhism, and how much of that has helped him in his seeking of truth? Bernardo, if you can answer that.
Sure. I mean, I'm not any kind of initiate, so I'll share a view with you for what it's worth, but I'm not sure you should take my particular view seriously. I don't. I entertain my view as a kind of a tentative account. That's all there is to it.
Well, that's all
years
right.
ago,
Yeah.
I found myself very unexpectedly in a state that made me sort of freak out after a couple of seconds. And when I popped out of it, the only thing that came to my mind was, oh, this is the Buddhist void. And if you ask me why did you make that association? I'm not sure, but it was the only thought that was in my mind. Like, oh, this was the Buddhist void. But I don't have any practice. I don't have any discipline. I was completely unprepared to find myself where I suddenly found myself. So I sort of bolted out of it, like a cornered animal running out of reflex. But I kept thinking about it for years afterwards, and trying to reconcile that with analytic idealism. And the way I found to reconcile that was that I also have a background in electronics engineering, and engineering came to my rescue here, because in engineering we have this concept of a carrier wave. When you set a station on your car radio, and you say, I set my car radio to 102 megahertz, that's a carrier wave. The carrier wave in and of itself is just a single tone. It doesn't have any information beyond that single tone, a single note. The voices you hear or the music you hear are distortions of that single tone. So if the single tone is a sinus, what you actually hear, the voices and the music, is just distortions around the sinusoidal wave. And within the context of that analogy, the way I try cumbersomely to account for the void is, the void is not an emptiness of experience, because I remember something. I experienced something. And Swamiji's words were perfect when he said that. I thought, this is it. I experienced emptiness, as opposed to having been in an emptiness of experience. And how do I account for it in the context of analytic idealism, in which every experience is an excitation of an underlying field of subjectivity? I think of it as a carrier wave. When you calm all the distortions, something is left behind which is still experienced. It's a carrier wave. In classical Hindu music, the best analogy would be how do they call the drone? It would be the drone of Hindu music, that almost constant note in the background of everything that is happening on top of that. So that's how I would account for it. It definitely entails some form of metacognition. You're not asleep. You recognize the absence of content of your mind, so much so that when you are out of it, you still remember it, and you can point to it. You can't describe it, but no, there was that. This was there, and you start gesticulating cumbersomely like a child. But yeah, I think it's the drone. I don't know. I'm probably wrong, but when I came to this idea, something calmed down inside me. It's like, okay, at least I have a tentative account.
If I can pitch in, Ivy, just a comment here. And the special value of that experience would be that now when I'm back to seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, interacting with the world and my own problems and everything, it's still that carrier wave. It's still the emptiness nature. So the calmness that you felt, Bernardo felt at that time, that calmness can be carried over, theoretically at least. It can be carried over into our experience of the world. So when now I'm listening to not the drone, but music and speech and talk, it's still emptiness, and you can be as calm here. One of the practices in Advaita is just imagine what it was like to be deeply asleep, in deep sleep. No world, no thoughts, no dreams, no sense of self, no sense of even thinking or even cognizing I am asleep. If you're doing that, you're not asleep. And yet you are there. And exactly that is the you who is here right now. And this entire world, and this is a stunning claim, this entire world of experience, what we are seeing now, was all there at that time. And there's nothing here which was not there in deep sleep. So you can carry over the absolute calm and peace and serenity of deep sleep into the waking hours.
So, Swamiji, would you say Bernardo experienced samadhi, the window of samadhi? Is that what it is?
I have no doubt that will be a little samadhi. If you can prolong it, that would be the definition of samadhi, because they remain there for a long time. But definitely that's a glimpse, and technically that would be a samadhi too.
I have no idea how to get back there. None whatsoever. I wouldn't know how to even begin.
Advaita would say that's not important. You don't have to chase the experiences. Rather, take the wisdom of that experience, what it showed you, and know that that's exactly here right now. And so we can calm down and relax and live our lives with that peace and that really ultimately deep peace and serenity. At every moment, it's available to us if we choose.
By the way, I would like to extend my thanks to Swamiji for such a wonderful and detailed, description of Shunyata. I've been hearing across, and I've been reading across, on different platforms, on different books. And thanks, Swamiji, for such a detailed, knowledge about Shunyata that you have. And also, thanks, Bernardo, for such a profound experience that you shared. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ari.
My question, I have one question each for both Swamiji and Bernardo. So, Bernardo, my question would be for you is now. Just correct me if I'm wrong. Now, the problem with consciousness is this: like entire philosophy of idealism is fundamentally based that consciousness is not an emergent property of matter. Now, the problem with hard problem of consciousness and others is that still now the neuroscience is not able to do that. And most of the arguments follows. But one criticism which comes in always is that just because it has not been able to do so doesn't mean that in the future it can't be. And so the argument should be why, if it is being proposed that consciousness is not an emergent property, then why it can't be emergent? Why it can't be an emergent property? So in the context of philosophy and in the context of your work, since you are a pioneer in that, would you like to share 1 or 2 points here for us that which shows that why it can't be an emergent property of matter? This was the question for you, Bernardo. And for Swamiji, I have one question. Now, we were all discussing here consciousness. Now, whatever little bit of understanding I have from the Indian school of thought, so I think so. Since consciousness is one important thing, but I think so. Since you are an Advaita and you are obviously going to defend Advaita and the Vedanta per se. But I think so. One more problem. I think so. In that worldview would be. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Would be the problem of memory, or the smriti. Now, again, in the context of materialism, till now it is not yet not hard. There's not enough hard evidence, but I think so. The memories, but lots of work has happened, which is being directed towards this hypothesis that memory can be reduced back to the mind, and but that would contradict the Vedanta and the Indian school of thought in the context that since mind is not a matter and it is Shukshma, and the Smriti is also Shukshma. So now, let's say in the future, yeah, if it ends up like some hard evidence has been gathered in neuroscience that memory can be reduced, so what will be an work around for it? And I'm quite sure you're already aware of it. And
I think the error underlying the question is a misallocation of the burden of truth. And let me try to illustrate this with a facetious example. Suppose I believe in the flying spaghetti monster. I think the flying spaghetti monster lives in a higher dimension that we can't see, but it is the thing that is moving the planets around the sun with its noodly appendages. And the evidence seems to be in favor of my hypothesis because the planets do move around the sun and we don't see any visible mechanism through contact pushing the planets around the sun. So I believe in the flying spaghetti monster. Now, can you or anyone prove that the flying spaghetti monster does not exist? No, nobody can disprove it. Nobody can disprove that there is right now a 19th century teapot in the orbit of Saturn, because aliens could have come to Earth in the 19th century, entered an old woman's house and stole her teapot and went back to the Pleiades, but on the way got bored with the teapot and dumped it, and it got caught in the gravity well of Saturn. You can't disprove that. Now, there are endless hypotheses that cannot be disproven. Now, why don't we take them seriously? Because we don't need to, because the burden of proof is not on the person who proposes more entities that are necessary to account for empirical experience. The person who maintains that there were aliens and teapots and robberies or invisible noodly monsters in extra dimensions, the burden of proof is on them to explain to us why we need to entertain all of those inflationary hypotheses for which we don't have direct evidence in order to make sense of nature. So when the materialist says there is this fundamental metaphysical category that is totally different from and outside mind, and it can be exhaustively described purely in quantitative terms and has no inherent qualities. Now, that is the flying spaghetti monster. That is the teapot in the orbit of Saturn. They have to argue why we need that extra hypothesis beyond the empirical given, which is mental stuff, mind stuff, consciousness stuff, because that's what we have before we begin theorizing. It's the only metaphysical given of nature that mental processes and qualities exist. So I cannot prove to you that mind or consciousness cannot be an emergent property, but I don't need to prove that to you. If I can come up with an account of nature that does not require that inflationary step, that spaghetti monster, that teapot in the orbit of Saturn, then that's it, because there are a great many other silly hypotheses that I also cannot disprove and nobody can disprove. Now, I can actually do better than that. And I can even argue that beyond whether it's possible or not, the very idea underlying the notion that mind is an emergent property of physical stuff is internally contradictory, because what we define as matter outside mind is quantities, like how many meters, how many kilograms, how many hertz, coulombs, joules, and so on and so forth. What are those quantities? Well, those quantities are descriptions of natural phenomena that are experienced on the screen of perception. Even if those natural phenomena are the patterns of clickings of instrumentation, measurement devices, they are still experienced as such. If those quantities were descriptions of physical stuff, the moment we now say that the physical stuff arises by emergence out of the quantities, we are contradicting ourselves. Because now what we are saying is Okay, we start by contemplating the territory. We describe the territory with a map. And now we say, oh, but wait a moment, the map precedes the territory. The quantities precede the qualities. And the qualities emerge somehow, nobody knows how, the qualities somehow emerge out of the quantities. That's entirely and strictly equivalent to saying the territory emerges out of the map. And that's, of course, internally contradictory because the map only has meaning as a description of pre-existing territory. If you say it precedes the territory, now the lines on the map mean nothing. They have no semantic grounding. Forget whether it's metaphysically true or not. It means nothing. You don't even get to the question of whether it's metaphysically true. You don't need to get there because it lacks any semantic content. It's an internal contradiction of a very strange line of thinking that when it began, it was known to be a political tool against the church, but somewhere between the 17th century and now we forgot about that. And we even know when we forgot that. We forgot that mid-19th century.
I don't think that's a major problem, for the worldview that we are talking about, the Advaitic or the Tibetan Buddhist worldview, or many of these idealistic philosophies. Memory, even machines have memory. You don't even have to bring in consciousness. Your calculator has memory. Your computer, your mobile phone has memory, and it strikes me as something very interesting that the new technology of robotics and AI and the internet, they are now very quickly replicating many activities of the human mind, which we thought were only possible for intelligent beings. So memory, then creativity. They're writing short stories and painting pictures, and then decision making, driving the Google driverless car. All of these are very good simulations or copies of what we do, except one thing. Except just one thing. There is no evidence of any first-person experience, any consciousness in any of these machines. And for that, you don't have to ask me. Just ask the experts. If you ask the engineers in Google and Facebook and all, are your programs, are your machines and robots, are they conscious? They'll say absolutely not. We have no idea at all at where to begin. Now, what strikes me is, in some sense, creativity, decision-making, these are complex things. And you are now able to make machines and programs which do that. AI can do that very well, a very good approximation, even better than human beings. In comparison to that, consciousness does what one might say a very simple thing. It just gives you first-person experience. It gives you experience itself. That's all. It doesn't do anything very complicated. So my question is, it should have been relatively easier to make machines conscious first. And creativity, playing chess and writing short stories should have been more difficult. But no, not at all. It's all of these are objective processes. If you look at it from an Advaitic analysis, it becomes very, very clear what's happening. Even the mental processes are all objective because they appear to consciousness. But consciousness is not an objective process, so it cannot be duplicated in that way. Memory is also something that appears to consciousness. So a machine has memory. It can demonstrate memory behavior. Let's put it this way. And we also have memory. We can demonstrate memory behavior. And we also have an internal experience of remembering, trying to remember, tip of the tongue phenomenon, or forgetting. All of these are first-person experiences. And consciousness can exist without memory also. Suppose a person who has got Parkinson's or Alzheimer's and literally forgets almost everything. Is that person unconscious? No, that's also a kind of being. The consciousness, according to Advaita Vedanta, is exactly the same and undimmed. I mean, if you have a philosophy which claims that consciousness is undimmed in deep sleep, then they would have no problem in saying that consciousness is fully present in an Alzheimer's patient, for example, who has no memory.
So very quickly, is there absolutely no way to prove that consciousness can affect the matter using scientific? Like I can lift my hand and consciousness has already affected the matter, and I can observe that the hand got moved and I moved the hand is what I report. So is there no way to kind of do this in a more scientific way and actually prove that, consciousness is managing this? And somewhere I think, Levin's experiments are kind of proving it, because a single cell cannot, form a body, and it's actually coordinated by external process. I mean, somewhere like that we can probably explore that, right?
Bernardo?
This question is to Bernardo.
You have to, I think the invitation I would make to you is to think about it in different terms. You're thinking in causal terms. How does your mind cause your arm to move? I invite you to think of it in terms of representational terms. Your arm moving is what a mental process looks like. It is how a mental process appears to observation from the outside, technically across the dissociative boundary. So don't think about, how the mind causes the arm to move, because if you think in those terms, you're thinking dualist terms, which then begs the question, because the hypothesis we are putting forward is precisely that there is no such dualism. So if you want to be consistent with the hypothesis, think of the movement of your arm as the appearance of a voluntary mental process. It's what it looks like, not the result of a cause, not the effect of a cause, but the appearance of a mental process.
No, but then it's then like a road taken, we take a left road instead of right road. So somewhere something is happening. I know, I mean, it's a tricky question, because in computer science terms, I say everything is abstract, so nothing is happening. But here, experientially, something is happening. So somewhere, where is the change? How to understand the change, right? Otherwise, I need to say basically that I have got all the options. It is like I'm making the change. I'm making a choice of where I have to going. In which case, I am basically like a god, in the sense that I can make any choice of affecting reality. How do you interpret that as?
Your personal mind is not the universal mind. Under analytic idealism, your personal mind is a dissociative segment of the underlying field of subjectivity. So you're not like God. You can't wish for the galaxy of Andromeda to suddenly look pink in the night sky. The causation, if we make a concession to language and we speak about events unfolding in time, within the framework of that concession, causation is a valid idea. What I am denying is causation across different metaphysical domains, from minds to matter. That's what I'm denying, because I deny that matter is a separate metaphysical domain from mind. So you have to look at what we colloquially call physical effects of mental processes. The best way to interpret them is to see the physical effects as what mental processes look like from a certain perspective. But mental processes can causally affect one another. Your thoughts can causally set the tone for your emotions. Your emotions can set the tone for your fantasies, which can set the tone for your dreams, which the next morning can set the tone for how you feel, which in turn set the tone of your thoughts, and so on and so forth. So this pattern of causation, I think ultimately it's a projection of something ineffable outside time, but within time, it's valid to speak of them. I think the error is in trying to see metaphysical causation across metaphysical domains. I think that is the error. Now, stuff is happening all the time, of course. Stuff is happening. Mind is self-exciting. Is there any implausibility underlying the concept of self-excitation? In other words, that mind can self-cause its own dynamics? No, because it's embedded in physics. In physics, each quantum field, and there are 17 of them, and they are all spatially unbound, and they are the only things that truly exist according to the standard model of particle physics. Each of these 17 quantum fields self-excites. And that's all there is to it. They self-excite. That's why we speak of the quantum foam or spontaneous quantum fluctuations. It's the self-excitation of the field. So there is nothing incoherent or implausible to speak of the self-excitation of consciousness. If you think of it as also as a spatially unbound field, it self-excites, and therefore it self-causes. That's perfectly fine.
Yes, greetings. I want to thank both Swamiji and Bernardo Kastrup for spending time with our group here. I don't have any particular questions. Just a big thank you for both of you to the concept of analytical idealism, which is an inquiry by itself, and for Swamiji for his wonderful collection of talks. So thank you. No questions. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Ivy, and thanks, Swami, and thanks, Bernardo. Okay, I want to thank Bernardo first because I'm really grateful to all the talks that you have given that give me a lot of insights and really opened up my, like, as you always mention, like the head is the bouncer of the heart. So it really allowed me for the heart to open up and follow the path of my heart. But my question here is to Swami. Like I am really practicing. I am a practicing Christian, so I do pray every day. Like I try to pray morning and night 2 times, and I also practice meditation. So I practice 15 minutes of meditation morning and evening. So my question is like at times I feel like these two are opposing each other. Like one is like a complete surrender, and the other, when I do meditate, it's like taking charge of the thing. So it feels like opposing each other, but it is both helping me in some ways. So I wanted to know how I can reconcile these two practices. So I'm sure you should have thought about this, so I thought of asking you this. So any help on this matter? Thanks.
Yes, it's a good question. And no, they are not contradictory. They may seem to be philosophically contradictory, surrender and taking charge, but practically they are not contradictory. I feel the more we have control over our attention, that's what meditation does. Any form of meditation basically gives you some amount of control over your attention, like restores attention to you. The more capable you will be of practices like surrender to God. Surrender to God would be a higher practice than meditation. Taking charge is one thing. Beyond that lies surrender. The more capable we are of focusing, of being calm and holding on to focus in the midst of disturbances, the more capable we'll be able of surrendering seriously.
So I hope you both of you really enjoyed the conversation, because I can tell Bernardo absolutely enjoying it.
I did.
And Swamiji, thank you. This talk is my birthday present. I organize it as a birthday present to meet you and Bernardo together. So
okay, happy birthday,
Ivy.
Happy birthday.
Such a good blessing.
Happy birthday, Ivy.
Yeah, I couldn't thank both of you enough.
Thank you.